Hello there, welcome back to Jennie Designs with Paper and this week's episode of Crime and Coloring, where we take an alphabetical journey through the United States and revisit the earliest crimes. But before we talk crime, let's talk coloring. To try and get the rest of the story into one video, I picked the most detailed stamp I could find. This is Honeybee Stamp's Bountiful Banner. I will be stamping it in Honeybee's Intense Black ink onto a piece of Neenah Classic Crest Solar White cardstock and coloring it with colored pencils. When I am done coloring, I will stamp it again in Versamark ink, and using rose gold embossing powder, I will create an overstamp. Sometimes when you use colored pencils, the wax kind of dulls down the image. And by using a gold embossing, a metallic embossing powder, if it doesn't line up exactly, it will look somewhat intentional. I think that's all about the coloring, so let's go ahead and jump back into the crime. We are once again taking our trip back to Vermont and St. Albans, where we are discussing the murder of 20-year-old spinster school teacher Marietta Ball. Marietta Ball, during the week, lived with wanton Abel, and on the weekends lived with her friend Clara Page because her father George's home was too far away for a daily commute. Marietta was well-liked, very sociable, and attended lots of social activities. On the 24th of July, Marietta closed up the schoolhouse for the week, packed up her belongings, and in the company of the Collins children headed to Clara Page's farm. At about 3:30 in the afternoon, she passed the Collins farm. The girls went home. Marietta continued to head south to the Page farm, only never to get there. Saturday afternoon, Clara was becoming more and more worried, so she hitched up her farm. She went to the Collins, hitched up her wagon, went back to the Collins farm, inquired as to whether or not they knew where she was, and upon learning that she had in fact left their farm at 3:30 the afternoon before, she alerted her husband, and they gathered together a search party. Local men, including Clara's husband Foster, gathered together to look for this school teacher. Marietta was just loved, and they were nervous and worried. When they started searching, they left the Collins farm and headed south, and they did find a place that it's called Ambuscade, I think is how you pronounce it. It's a place of ambush, where some branches and things in the bushes were clearly cut out so somebody could watch the comings and goings on the road. About 1 o'clock in the morning, Frank Harris gave a cry, and everybody came running to him, and what they found was Marietta's dead body. The coroner's inquest was opened under the direction of H.H. Farnsworth, which is great, except that he was a carpenter turned insurance salesman who was currently serving as the justice of the peace. He had very little legal training and no criminal investigative experience. The postmortem was conducted by doctors. They confirmed that Marietta had been killed by a blunt instrument, probably a rock, that she was in fact sexually assaulted and then murdered. Another prominent name in the area was Aldous Brainerd. He was the mill owner. He was also the son of a former senator. He came from the village to the hill to help with the investigation, and he took control of the search for evidence. They looked and they found more things that indicated that Marietta had in fact been attacked and murdered. This investigation kind of pitted the wealthier members of the village against the less wealthier or indigent members of the town that lived up on the hill. It also was multiple people were suspected and accused of this crime. The first was Frank Harris, a freed African-American man who lived on the Page farm. Once his alibi cleared him, he packed up his stuff and moved to Maine, and he stayed away from Vermont for decades. I don't blame him. I think I would have done the same thing. The next man arrested was a French-Canadian tramp, air quotes you can't see. He was a man who lived on the hill. His alibi was proven and he was released. A family of a student was investigated because of a disciplinary issue between their child and the teacher. That was also set aside. There was another French-Canadian man who worked on the trains who was investigated because of his attempt to court Marietta the year before, and when she turned him down, he had become quite violent. In fact, he lost his job because of it. All of this was happening at the same time that George is trying to bury his daughter. George is anger and grief turned into vengeance. He didn't think that Marietta had been killed by somebody on the hill. He believed that even in a mask, she would recognize who they were. And he firmly believed that her murder was somebody who lived in the village. H.H. disagreed. He believed that, well, he continued to investigate the people who lived on the hill. He was joined by Private Detective Noble Flanagan, who happened to be one of the more premier investigators in the area. He was in the area on other business and offered his services. They also got a hint or a tip from a medium who went by the name of Sleeping Lucy, who said that Marietta's attacker would have scratches all over his face. They did find a man who worked at the mill, a man called LaPaize, L-A, capital P-A-I-Z-E, who had scratches on his face, but those scratches were made while picking berries with fellow workers. The next man who was in the spotlight was Wanton Abel, Marietta's weekday landlord. His alibi was that after a hard day working in the field, he fell asleep in the shade. So he was sleeping about the same time that Marietta would have been murdered. H.H. did not believe that, but he was forced to release him due to there was nothing else. After his arrest, Wanton was worried about his reputation. He went to speak to a friend, and his friend was Abel Brainerd, or is his first name Abel? I can't remember. Yeah, not Abel. Aldous Brainerd. Yeah, the son of the former governor. Yeah. But the thing that was interesting was that Aldous told him to pay attention to what happened around the town, the hill, his farm, and then report back to him, not to H.H. And that's kind of weird. And that's even more suspicious because the next man that was in the spotlight was a man named George Gregory Smith. And we're calling him GG because he has the same first name as Marietta's father. He was the nephew of Aldous Brainerd and the grandson of the former governor. And I think that's where we left off last week. So, as GG becomes a suspect, the idea or the rumor was that 29-year-old GG had met 20-year-old Marietta at a dance in Bakersfield. And the story went both ways, that GG had insulted Marietta and that Marietta had insulted GG. There was no, it went both ways. But either way, that disagreement between the two had led to the incident on the 24th, her murder. Now, Marietta's father, George, was among those firmly convinced that GG was guilty. The Ball family was on familiar terms with the Smiths, but they weren't really friendly with them. And Marietta it was public knowledge that she regularly attended these social dances in Bakersfield. So it seemed plausible. Also, I think that George was remembering how a couple years before this, Marietta had been chased through the village one evening. And that was that incident was never investigated. We talked about that last week. George discussed his theory with his friend, Dr. John Branch, who also lived on the hill. And he took it upon himself to communicate George's suspicions to the authorities. Now, Detective Flanagan questioned GG and then investigated his alibi and reported that the alibi was impeachable. He was supposedly playing billiards with a friend at the Weldon House Hotel. George Ball and Dr. John Branch and even Wanton didn't really believe the alibi was as unimpeachable as Detective Flanagan believed it was. And they continued to put forth their theory, spread rumors about GG's involvement in Marietta's murder. After Marietta's murder, in August after her murder, at least one of her brothers came from California to visit their father and pay their respects. And they tried to convince George to leave with them and settle in California. But George was indebted to a neighbor. He had borrowed some money, and he could not leave without paying that money. And then suddenly, the debt was paid, he was flush, and he was moving out of town. This caused all kinds of red flags. People were suspicious. It seemed that this added more to that conspiracy. But it turns out that his sons had paid off his debt and financed his move to California. Before he left, George had a conversation with Dr. Branch, and he said he no longer believed that Gigi was a suspect in his daughter's death. He now believed it was Frank because he left town. But dude, wouldn't you? I would. Dr. Branch wasn't so sure. He had his own opinions. Dr. Branch thought that the quick change of opinion about Gigi was evidence of this conspiracy. He was in that conspiracy category. He was beginning to think that George had been paid off by Gigi's grandfather, the former governor. He also believed that Gigi's alibi had been paid for. Dr. Branch took his suspicions to H.H. Farnsworth for further investigation, but H.H. said, "Yeah, no thanks. I don't think he had anything to do with it." As far as H.H. was concerned, George Gregory was not a suspect, and Gigi was offended at having been considered a suspect. He actually wrote to the St. Albans selectmen demanding a hearing, and his hearing was granted and took place on July 20th and 21st, 1875, almost a year after Marietta's death. In the hearing, Gigi questioned Detective Flanagan. Flanagan confirmed he had been the one who interviewed Gigi and had verified his alibi, and that no, he had not been bribed. He also confirmed that George Ball wasn't paid off. He was the one who learned that George's sons had paid his debt and financed his move to California. The hearing also examined Gigi's relationship to Marietta. It quickly became apparent that there was, in fact, no relationship. A man named William Chadwick was the person who ran the Bakersfield Hotel where the dances were held, and he confirmed that Marietta was there regularly, but he could not ever remember having seen Gigi there. And a friend who attended the dances with Marietta testified that she never heard her mention, that Marietta never mentioned Gigi to her. Gigi then called out those who had been spreading rumors about him and about the case in general, and he said, quote, "Anyone who thinks that they are in possession of any fact or circumstance that tends to connect me in any manner with this crime, I want them to produce it now," end quote. No one could or did, and with that, Gigi called for an end of the hearing. And going a step beyond that, Selectman Newton ended the investigation into the murder of Marietta completely by saying, quote, "The investigation of the murder so far as the town is concerned ceases." And just like that, no one to try, no one to convict, and no one to sentence. The public hearing ended on Wednesday, the 21st of July, 3 days before the 1-year anniversary of the day Marietta was killed. On the 24th, a morning group of 150 people assembled on East Hill near the site of the attack. A prayer was offered by Reverend W.B. Howard, and he delivered a eulogy in remembrance of Marietta. And he urged that St. Albans community to, quote, "unite for the common defense and for the suppression of crime," end quote. When the sermon concluded, the mourners formed themselves into a solemn assembly or a solemn procession, and they headed through the broken timber to the place where Marietta was killed. They beautified the place. They turned an ugly thing beautiful by laying flowers and wreaths and draping the trees in black crepe. 2 weeks later, on August 7th of 1875, a monument was placed at the site that consisted of a white marble column with the following inscription: "Marietta N. Ball, murdered July 24th, 1874, age 20. Passing along this highway from the school which she was teaching, it is supposed that she was assailed by a masked villain from an ambuscade, was taken to a thicket midway between the road and this spot, and killed by blows to her head. Her body was then taken here, laid out, and found at 1:00 a.m., July 26th, end quote. And that was it. Okay, but not really, because I'm telling the story, so of course that's not it, right? This is a good time to introduce you to Joseph LePage. Joseph LePage was actually born Joseph Paget, or Paget, P-A-G-E-T, in 1835 or 36 in St. Melanie of Quebec. His father was a farmer, and a quite respectable one, as was Joseph himself. When Joseph was 20, he married Eulalie Rousseau. of St. Ambrose. The couple had 5 children together, 3 sons and 2 daughters. In 1861, the family moved to the village of Chertsey, where Joseph's behavior began to change. He began to run with a rough crowd, developing some less than pleasant habits, including becoming abusive toward his wife and children. There was one specific event that was recorded where Joseph forced his wife to hitch herself to the wagon, or he hitched her to the wagon, and used her as the beast of burden on the farm for the day. So not an awesome individual. Now, Joseph's family remained in Chertsey for 4 or 5 years until 1865 or 1866, and when they returned to St. Ambrose, and then moved quickly to St. Beatrice. But Joseph was rapidly losing control. In 1871, he sexually assaulted his sister-in-law, Julianne, his wife's sister. He choked her into unconsciousness, leaving her for dead. She wasn't dead, and when she regained consciousness, she was able to identify him and describe exactly what he was wearing and what he did. He was arrested, he escaped from custody, and fled into the woods. A couple of months after his escape, he returned to St. Beatrice to collect his family, and they traveled south, crossing the border into Vermont. The LePage family arrived in St. Albans in the fall of 1871, and they settled on East Hill, and they began using the name LePaize, L-A-P-A-I-Z-E, and they rented out the Ladue farm. Now, in October 6th of 1875, Wednesday morning, Aldous Brainerd is at his home in St. Albans, and he's reading the morning paper, and he unfolds the Daily Messenger and opens it to a second page, and he is struck by a headline that read, quote, "Another New Hampshire horror, a schoolgirl outraged and murdered," end quote. Outraged was the way they publicized the fact that she was sexually assaulted. Now, Aldous is reading about 70-year-old Josie Longmaid, who disappeared on Monday on her way to school and whose body was found in the woods of a swamp. The detail, well, we'll get into the details later, but not really. I'm not getting into the details because they're not pleasant, and that's not what this channel is about, right? Aldous' thoughts were immediately taken to July the year before, when Marietta was, here we go, air quotes, outraged and murdered. He thought it had to be the same person. They had to be connected. So he calls in his friend and neighbor, Wanton. Now, he and Wanton were not as close as they had been before. In fact, since the hearing in July of 1884, they really hadn't been social with each other. However, Aldous asked Wanton if he had known anyone moving away from the hill in the last year. And to his surprise, the answer was yes. Wanton said that a French-Canadian family by the name of LePaize, or was it LePage, had left the area. That Joseph, the father, was something of a drifter, aka a tramp, given to wandering the woods of East Hill. He spoke little English, worked as a farmhand and a wood chopper. And he remembered, so Aldous remembered this man, he's like, oh, dude, I remember that guy. He was kind of a shabby-looking guy. He wore moccasins and a straw hat, and he had black hair and black eyes. But the most surprising thing about this revelation was that this Joseph LePaize, or LePage, had relocated his family to, dun dun dun, Suncook, New Hampshire. Josie Longmaid was born in November of 1857. She was the oldest of her parents' 5 children. Her father's name was James. I did not write down her mom's name. And they were of the more wealthy residents of the Pembroke, New Hampshire area. This is a township near Concord that encompassed the village of Suncook. Like Marietta, Josie was loved in her community. She was young and beautiful. She was active in Sunday school. She was a good and talented and gifted student. She went to a school called the Academy, which was not far from her home, about 1.5 miles through the woods and the swampy area. And typically, Josie walked to school with her friend Lila Fowler. The 2 girls would meet at a specific point and then walk the rest of the way together on the edge of the woods on Academy Road. On Monday, October 4th, Lila Fowler arrived at the meeting place as usual, but Josie wasn't there. Lila waited, but when her friend never arrived, she accepted a ride from a passing neighbor. She supposed Josie was ahead of her and they would see each other at the academy. They didn't. In fact, Josie was running late, very late. Her brother Waldo left home at school at 8, but it was another 30 minutes or so before Josie followed, hurrying along in her blue cape with her school books under her arm. She passed the Hoyt farm at about 8:30, and then afterward had a pleasant good morning, exchange with Deacon Guile as he drove past her on the road, and no one saw her after that. At about 4:30 that afternoon, her brother Waldo returned home and asked his mom why Josie wasn't at school. Now, Mom panics because not only is Josie not known for being mischievy, she doesn't cut class. She doesn't ditch school. So Josie's mother gets a hold of her father, James, and James sent a messenger into town to alert the community. And by 7 o'clock that night, a search party of about 100 people assembled near the woods on Academy Road. They began to search, and as the sun went down, the men lit lanterns, and they continued to search along Academy Road until they came to a patch of trodden down grass beside the roadway. A struggle obviously had taken place there, and there were tracks leading into the woods of Giles Swamp. A man named Daniel Merrill found a body. He shouted, the men converged, and the lanterns illuminated a scene of horror. Josie lay on her back with one arm across her chest, the other pinned beneath her. Her head was gone, her skirts were shredded and saturated and cut away from her body and then draped over her body like a burial shroud. James retrieved his daughter and took her home, where a post-mortem examination was conducted. I don't know if it was at his home or somewhere else, but a post-mortem was conducted, and it was determined that Josie had been sexually assaulted and then decapitated with a small, sharp knife. They also found, we'll get to that in a minute. The newspaper said that the damage to her was, quote, too horrible for publication. So when the sun comes up the next day, a man named Charles Seeley, Cilley, began searching for more evidence, and he found a thick club that was broken into two pieces alongside Academy Road. And one end of this club was sticky with blood, but then seemed like somebody had taken sand to kind of clean it off. He also recovered Josie's school book, and other searchers turned up her hat, her hair switch, and her comb. Later that morning, Josie's head was found wrapped in her own blue cape. Her skull was intact, but it had been badly beaten, and there was a man's boot print on her face. Detectives Clifton Hildreth and Albion Dearborn were hired to pursue the investigation, and they quickly settled on 22-year-old William Drew, who lived near the crime scene and was seen in the vicinity on the morning of October 4th. William had previously worked with his father, a butcher, and had a reputation of being less than an awesome individual. But most compelling was that William was known to carry a sharp knife, which, when asked to produce, was missing. So William was arrested. He was transported to the jail in Suncook, where he was held in custody while the detectives continued their investigation. They spoke with a 17-year-old girl named Carrie, who claimed to be friends with Josie, and she told them a story about William that was concerning. According to Carrie, William had surprised Josie on her way to school one morning, and his conversation, probably what we would call catcalling, but his conversation struck Josie in a less than pleasant way, and she hit him with her parasol. William swore he would get even and threatened to, quote, cut off her head. The story was widely circulated and apparently untrue. William actually had a very provable alibi for the time of the murder, and Carrie became an untrustworthy witness. And I didn't look into why or how she would have told that story, but anyway. About the same time that William was being investigated, things were going on in St. Albans, right? So there is a little bit of discrepancy on how this connection was made. Wanton Abel said that he was the one who read the story, And he was the one who was convinced that Josie and Marietta's murders were connected, that he told HH, or that when he told HH had very little memory of Joseph LePage, and he didn't really want to contact the authorities in Suncook, but did so because Wanton insisted. Later years, Wanton would attempt to claim the reward offered by the selectmen of Pembroke. He was not successful. He sued the town and he lost. Aldous' account of this situation didn't surface until 1905 when he was 81. The reward money was gone by then, and Wanton and HH were both dead. And so he had very little to gain by coming forward. And he wrote a letter to a newspaper and recalled how he had read about Josie's murder, and he recognized the similarities to Marietta's murder, and he sent for Wanton, and Wanton came to his office, and Aldous said, quote, "Sometime afterward, Mr. Abels called at my office and told me that he had tried to get a part of the reward offered by the town of Suncook. I told him he should have known better that he was working for me, and that both he and Mr. Farnsworth knew I was not working for pay," end quote. So regardless of how the connection was made, it was made, and whether it was Aldous or Wanton, they wanted the authorities in Sunbrook to know what had happened there in St. Albans, and they encouraged HH to go to New Hampshire and talk to the investigators. HH did not want to travel. He sent a letter instead. Okay, and part of his letter says, quote, "Gents, I have thought best to write you after hearing of the terrible affair which has occurred in your midst. 1 year ago, on the 24th of last July, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, as Miss Ball was going from the schoolhouse to her house, she was murdered in a small piece of woods. Among the persons suspected there was one by the name of Parrish or LePage. He was strongly suspected and was examined, but I was not satisfied. Should you have occasion to investigate him, I should be glad to know the result," end quote. So the problem here is that Wanton disagrees with HH ever having been that hot on Joseph's trail. Okay, so there is some dispute about who, where, when, why, and how. But the connection was made. The letter was sent. And even though HH did not go to Suncook and speak with the investigators, he did kind of trigger something, because the selectman who received the letter was Trueworthy Fowler. And Trueworthy was the father of Lila, Josie's friend. And more than that, Trueworthy had hired Joseph LePage as early as the month before Josie's murder to help thrash the rye. Joseph spent several days on the Fowler farm, and it was very likely that not only had he seen Lila, he had probably seen Josie, because the girls spent their time together. Even more interesting in that is that Joseph was sought for questioning by the detectives in Suncook, but as a witness. Someone had seen him in the area of Josie's disappearance, and because William was the suspect they were zeroing in on, they didn't even think that Joseph could be more than a witness. When he was brought in for questioning, he told detectives that he was chopping wood at the time of the murder. He said he'd left home early, around 6, and visited the local bakery, then took his axe and entered the woods. Only he lost his way and wandered around the forest until he came upon a group of workmen building a shanty. The men were able to direct him, and he emerged out of the woods around 2 in the afternoon, and the detectives took his story at face value. They were so convinced that William was the guy. The state attorney general, however, was not as convinced. He hired a new detective, Moses Sargent, to lead the investigation, a step that Detective Dearborn later said was a personal insult. Moses was a highly experienced investigator and former captain of the detective force in Boston. He traveled by train to Suncook, proceeded straight to the LePage home, and placed Joseph under arrest. Moses noted that Joseph's overcoat was spotted with blood, and he confiscated the man's knife, razor, and his clothes and boots. Everything was sent for analysis. Moses's instincts proved sound. Blood on the overcoat was confirmed to be human, and a doctor was able to match Joseph's boot heel to marks on Josie's face. Other evidence emerged. Multiple witnesses placed Joseph near Academy Road on the morning of the murder, and 2 women identified Joseph as the strange man who had chased them in late September. This is way too familiar, you guys. Way too familiar. The strongest evidence against Joseph, though, was from another of Trueworthy Fowler's sons, Andrew. When Joseph was working on the Fowler farm, Lila came home from school, and Joseph noticed her and asked Andrew who she was and where she went to school. Andrew said she was his sister, but he did not admit to telling Joseph where she got to school or where she went to school. And Andrew's story suggests that Lila was likely the intended victim, that most likely after Joseph left the bakery and found a place to hide, to wait for Lila. When Lila didn't come, and before he gave up, Josie happened to wander by. On January 4th, 1876, Joseph stood trial in Concord for the murder of Josie. The proceedings lasted 9 days in total. On the first day, the jurors were sworn in and traveled to Suncook to visit the crime scene, and they were accompanied by Joseph, who reportedly showed no emotion. Back in the courtroom, Josie's parents detailed the circumstances of her disappearance, and friends and neighbors described the search that took place on the 4th and the finding of her body in the swamp. With the facts established, the prosecution presented its case. Witnesses placed Joseph near the crime scene on October 4th and testified of his habit of chasing young women. Experts detailed the physical evidence against him, the blood on his clothes, the marks on Josie's face. They described her injuries and mutilations in what was called distressing detail, and they confirmed that Joseph's knife could have in fact been the murder weapon. The defense, of course, sought to cast doubt on the prosecution's findings through cross-examination, but their efforts did little to affect the jury. And the evidence against Joseph was already overwhelming by the time that Julianne took the stand, his sister-in-law. Julianne testified in court about her 1871 assault. She testified about where she was, what she was doing, what happened, who did it, what he was wearing, and that he had tried to kill her and was unsuccessful. She recognized him as soon as she told everybody as soon as she regained consciousness who it was. The jury was sent for deliberation. They took a single vote and then returned with a guilty verdict. The courtroom erupted in applause. Josie's parents clutched each other. They were weeping, and the judge then handed down the sentence. And the sentence read, quote, "As a servant of the law, the court decrees that you be imprisoned in the state prison at Concord until the 19th day of January in the year of our Lord, 1877, and that on that day between the hours of 10 in the forenoon and 2 in the afternoon, you will be hanged from the neck until dead. And pardon me to say that all the days to come to you in this life must be full of sorrow." End quote. H. Farnsworth attended the trial. At one point, he was even called in for questioning, but his testimony wasn't permitted because it was not in relation to Josie's murder. Joseph was never tried for the murder of Marietta Bell. Sorry, I keep calling Marietta. Yeah, Marietta Bell. Ball. Wow, you guys. Marietta Ball. Sorry, words are hard. After Joseph's sentencing, the newspaper in Concord spoke with somebody from St. Albans. He didn't name the man, but is likely H. Farnsworth. And again, claimed that Joseph was always a suspect, but couldn't be charged due to the lack of evidence. Wow. By the time of Joseph's trial, George Ball was in California, and his health was declining. He was old. His body was wearing out. Joseph was sentenced on January 13th, and George died just 6 days later. His body was transported to St. Albans, and he was buried in Greenwood Cemetery next to his daughter. Joseph's lawyers did file an appeal, and they won. A judge determined that Julianne's testimony should not have been permitted. It didn't have anything to do with Josie's murder. Joseph was retried in 1877 and convicted again, and this time sentenced to hang on March 15th of 1878. The evening before his sentence was to be carried out, he was transferred from his cell to a sitting room where he met with two priests and conversed with them in French. And the priest left just before midnight, and for about half an hour he sat perfectly quiet before dropping to his knees in front of the prison warden, sobbing. He said, quote, "I killed two girl, too bad, end quote." He admitted to killing Josie, and his description was the same as what was described in court. He said that his wife called him a bad man and burned his clothing, something she later denied. He also finally confessed to Marietta's murder. And while the warden didn't have the facts of the case, Joseph was able to provide a hand-drawn map of the crime scene and described in detail how he committed that murder. And he also said that the Sleepy Lucy's claim that the killer of Marietta would have scratches on his face scared him, and he planned to leave that right then, but he was afraid that would increase suspicion on him. On March 15th, 1878, Joseph was led to the gallows. A hood was placed over his head and noose fastened about his neck. Sheriff Dodge read the warrant, pronounced the sentence, and sprung the trap. Joseph died quickly, but was left hanging for about half an hour before taken down. Nobody knew what to do with him. He had been excommunicated from the Catholic Church after his attack on his sister-in-law, Julianne, and nobody knew where to bury him. Eventually, he was taken down and buried in a pauper's grave in Concord's Blossom Hill Cemetery. H.H. Farnsworth and Josie's father were both in the crowd during the execution. After the story of Joseph's execution and trial ran in the papers, other reports started to surface about disappearances and murders in places where Joseph had lived. Also, about 2 months after his execution, his name was back in the papers because that farm he was renting in St. Alban, the owner of the farm was tearing down a barn, and when he tore it down, he found women's undergarments inside it, covered in blood, and they were able to confirm they belonged to Marietta. Joseph's wife never returned to St. Albans. They stayed in Suncook until about 1878, 1880, and then they went to Massachusetts, and the children worked in the cotton mills, and she kept home. She never remarried, she never changed her name, and she died in Fitchburg in 1898, and she never admitted to believing her husband was guilty. Now, Wanton Abel died in Massachusetts in 1891. H.H. Farnsworth passed away in 1902. Aldous Brainerd died in 1906. George Smith left St. Albans, and after 1880, he ended up in Florence, Italy, where he spent the final 25 years of his life. He died in 1918. East Hill is now called French Hill. The old road is gone, so is the sawmill. Marietta's monument is forgotten, and all that is left of her is her grave in Greenwood Cemetery near her father. Now, I will admit that in an attempt to get this story condensed into just 2 weeks instead of 3, because that would have just been ridiculous, there are some details about Joseph's background and Josie's murder that I left out. The sources are linked below in the description video if you want to go read the articles that I used for this story. There's a lot to unpack here. If H.H. Farnsworth and Detective Flanagan hadn't been so sure that they knew who'd done it so many times, Joseph may have come up on their radar sooner. And I think it is, now this is all hindsight, right? I wasn't there, I don't know. Based on what I read, I think it is rather self-serving of H.H. to then say Joseph was always on his radar. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't, but why would you pull that up when you didn't do anything with it? It's irrelevant. You know, you either intentionally overlooked it or you missed it. So why would you? I don't know. I feel like it's self-serving. But how much, even going back to when Joseph assaulted his sister-in-law, had he not escaped then, how many other crimes would not have taken place? They didn't specifically connect Joseph to the other crimes that had happened in St. Alban that summer, the murder of the store clerk and the vandalizing and the breaking and entering. But they definitely alluded to the fact that he was probably the one who chased Marietta, and there was testimony from women in New Hampshire that he chased them around town. So I don't know. I know that we're so used to modern day forensics, right? We are so used to the DNA that transferred that it's almost impossible these days in 2025 to get away with this kind of a crime. But I feel like if there hadn't been such a conflict between those in the village and those on the hill, and if Aldous hadn't been trying to control the whole situation in an attempt to keep his family out of it, or whatever his motivation was, and maybe it's just because he owned the mill where Joseph was seen and occasionally worked, I don't know. I just feel like maybe it could have been solved sooner and maybe Josie would not have had to suffer the same fate. Woulda, coulda, shouldas. I know. That's a lot of woulda, coulda, shouldas. One thing I forgot to mention at the beginning of the video is that when I got all done coloring and putting the card together, I didn't love the centers of the yellow flowers, so I pulled out some flat back pearls. My intent was to use some that kind of were the same color as that rose gold embossing powder, but it didn't pull them out anymore, so I used these opaque white pearls, and I just put one pearl in the center of each of those yellow flowers, and I felt like that kind of made the flower centers pop again. As soon as I colored them in with that brown colored pencil, I knew that I didn't like it, but can't go back at that point. So I am curious as to what you think about this story. Do you feel like it was personal? Like, was Aldous Brainerd intentionally interfering with the investigation, or was he just trying to be the boss of the world? Was it due to lack of criminal experience on H.H. Farnsworth's part, or was it social? Was it just that social conflict? I'm curious what you think. Let me know down below. I did find pictures. This is the newspaper reprint of a photograph of Marietta Ball. And this is a picture of Joseph. He has 3 different last names. Take your pick. Thanks for hanging out with me today. I appreciate you hanging out for this long story. I have a couple of other videos here I think you would like. I've also added that subscribe button. If you haven't subscribed, I would love it if you did. Give me a thumbs up if you liked the video, comment down below, and I hope you have a really fabulous day.